Hi, everyone. Hopefully, your first week of remote learning is going well. We're going to continue our work in FEA with our continued study of educational psychology. And today, we're going to take a look at Howard Gardner and his theory on multiple intelligences. So, Howard Gardner viewed intelligence as the capacity to solve problems, to fashion products that are valued in one or more cultural setting. And this idea of one or more cultural setting is important. I think that really speaks to this idea of multiple intelligences and that there are multiple ways to sort of look at things and to sort of figure things out and solve them. Now, Gardner initially came up with a list of 7 intelligences. We'll spend a few minutes going through each one and talking about them. This was a provisional list in that it's sort of ongoing, right? And even today, right, still psychologists are still working with this and still potentially adding different intelligences. And there are a handful of others that he's considered as well, and we'll talk about at the very end. Now, these first few, right, are the ones that typically we see in schools. Okay, typically these are the ones that teachers draw upon or that students are forced to use in the traditional school setting. The next three are generally associated with the arts. And then finally, we have what Gardner himself referred to as his personal intelligences. Our first one is called linguistic intelligence, okay, involving sensitivity to spoken and written language. If you've had somebody who, or you've ever met somebody, say, who just seems really gifted with words, right? They're able to speak quite well, write quite well, without really much practice. Howard Gardner would say, wow, this person has very strong linguistic intelligence. Writers, poets, lawyers, speakers. These are groups of individuals that Gardner would kind of set aside and say, hey, these have really high levels of what we call linguistic intelligence. The second one is logical or mathematical intelligence. These are people who we generally look at and say, wow, they are really good with numbers. Not just numbers, but also logic. They can carry out mathematical operations, they can investigate um, different issues from a scientific standpoint, very good in using the quote unquote scientific method. As Gardner would say, it entails the ability to detect patterns, reason deductively, think logically. And a lot of times, that sort of thinking is generally associated with the sciences, generally associated with math. The next one called musical intelligence, all right, involving skill in performance, composition, apprehension of musical patterns. It generally includes our ability to recognize and compose musical pitches and tones and understand the rhythms and identify all of them as well. I think it's important to note that Gardner feels musical intelligence runs in an almost structural parallel to linguistic intelligence, and I think there's also a direct connection with the mathematical intelligences as well. Typically, students who are very good with music tend to be really good with math as well. If they understand music theory and the patterns involved, they generally do a really good job in identifying different patterns in mathematical theory as well. The next one is bodily or kinesthetic intelligence, right? The potential of using one's whole body or parts of the body to solve the problem. These are just the naturally coordinated kids. The ones who can use their physical attributes to solve problems pretty readily and pretty easily. And for Gardner, there's a connection. There's a direct connection between mental and physical activity, and so this one doesn't really act on its own. Next one is spatial intelligence, specifically involving the potential to recognize and use the patterns of wide space and more confined areas. I always think of someone who can open up the trunk of their car or truck and have all this luggage that they need to put in there, and they can just look at the luggage, look at the space, and then fit it all in like a puzzle. Um, and it's puzzles themselves. People who are really good at jigsaw puzzles, who can kind of see it and kind of piece it all together. Those are people with very good spatial intelligence. They can visualize how these things piece together and then actually do it. The next one is interpersonal intelligence. Okay, this is the capacity to understand the intentions and motivations and desires of everyone else, right? These are people who are really good at developing relationships because they understand what that other person is going through. They understand what that person is trying to accomplish. They understand what's motivating them, what their desires are. There's a tremendous sense of empathy there with this interpersonal intelligence. Teachers, for example, generally have high levels of interpersonal intelligence. Salespeople, religious, even political leaders, counselors, right? All of them need this sort of highly tuned, well-developed sense of interpersonal intelligence. And then lastly, intrapersonal intelligence. Now, this is more your ability to understand you, right? Appreciate your own feelings, appreciate and understand your fears, your motivations. Yeah, in Gardner's view, it involves creating and having this effective working model of ourselves and being able to use that information about ourselves sort of to, regulate or to function in our lives. So, with these seven intelligences, as well as the ones we'll talk about in a minute, it's important to note that they don't operate independently. It's not like you're only one of these things. In fact, the vast majority of us have some combination of all of them. And it's not to say that you can't be exceptional in multiple ones or that you can't have weaknesses in multiple ones. And you don't just turn one off and turn one on. They all are used in concert with one another. And for the vast majority of us, they complement each other, right? Especially as we continue to grow, as we learn, as we develop skills, and as we practice solving different problems. Now, what does this look like in education? Um, and it's really been embraced in a lot of ways by different educational theorists and perhaps most significantly by teachers in the classroom and certainly policymakers as well. There are a lot of schools around the country that have looked to this theory and have basically structured their entire school around this idea of these multiple intelligences and design their classrooms and design their activities and design, in some cases, really the whole school to reflect that understanding and to really capture and take advantage of what they perceive as their students' intelligences and their strengths. And it's not limited. We see it in preschool, we see it in elementary school, middle school, high school, we see it in vocational settings, we see it with, alternative education, adult ed type situations as well. Now, Gardner would tell us that really, we don't have to be exceptional in all seven intelligences, but we need them all to live well. And so our job as teachers has to be to attend to all of them. We can't just focus on those first two traditional ones. We can't just focus on linguistic or mathematical. It can't just be about, reading, writing, and arithmetic. We've got to go for all of them and we've got to tap into all of them. And we've got to take advantage of the strengths that our students have and provide them with opportunities to develop the weaknesses that they have as well. And for him and for a lot of us, this means going for depth over breadth, right? Instead of trying to cover a vast array of concepts and ideas, picking a much smaller number and then really going into exceptional depth with those ideas. So, since his original list came out in the early 80s, okay, there's been a lot of discussion about adding different intelligences to this list. And so there's been a number of research studies done by his colleagues, by Gardner as well. And basically, there are three potential add ons: naturalist intelligence, spiritual intelligence, and existential intelligence. Now, naturalist intelligence, this one has really been, for all intents and purposes, added onto the list, right? This is sort of the eighth intelligence, and it's one that we're going to work with in our follow up. Now, this basically is our ability to recognize, categorize, and draw upon different features of the environment. right? We're able to see things in nature, we're able to identify behaviors and patterns and use that to solve different problems that we encounter. Now, spiritual intelligence isn't so easy, right? And it's not readily agreed upon by all the quote unquote experts. And in fact, here I'll read for you what Gardner said about it. It seems more responsible to carve out that area of spirituality closest in spirit to the other intelligences, and then, in the sympathetic manner applied to naturalist intelligence, ascertain how this candidate intelligence fares. In doing so, I think it's best to put aside the term spiritual, with its manifest and problematic connotations, and to speak instead of an intelligence that explores the nature of existence in its multifarious guises. Thus, an explicit concern with spiritual or religious matters would be one variety, often the most important variety, of an existential intelligence. So, basically, Gardner doesn't like this idea of spiritual necessarily because there's so many different ways to look at it. And really, it's almost like a combination. When we think of it, it's almost like a combination of this naturalist intelligence that I mentioned before and this existential intelligence that I'll get to in a second. Because really, this spiritual idea is really about what it means to exist. And, for him, it was really hard to put this very specific label. So while this idea of spiritual intelligence is out there and it's debated and it's being studied, it really isn't formally a part of his list of intelligences yet. And this last one, existential intelligence, right? A concern with ultimate issues is thus the next possibility that Howard Gardner considers. And he argues that it scores reasonably well. However, empirical evidence is sparse, and although a ninth intelligence might be attractive, Howard Gardner not quite ready to put it on the list. I find the phenomenon perplexing enough and the distance from the other intelligence vast enough to dictate prudence, at least for now. So essentially, there's this idea, for those of you that remember studying existentialism, perhaps in your junior English classes, talking about these big picture ideas, right? Sort of meaning of life type stuff. And there are those of us who are certainly more predisposed to be able to conquer and think about those very abstract ideas. But it's hard to sort of put it in concrete empirical terms. And that's where Gardner kind of struggles. It's not very easy just to say, this is where this category is and this is how it lines up. And so it's kind of like spiritual. There's a lot of different ways to look at it. There's a lot of different ways to think about it. And so with that ambiguity, right, that's going to make it a little bit more of a challenge to identify. So we can't really add it onto the list. So while spiritual and existential are certainly candidates for possible inclusion, right now Gardner's holding on to just those eight, ending with naturalist. All right, so that's that with Gardner's theory of intelligences. Hopefully, you've got a pretty good feel for it now. We are going to continue to do some follow up work with this, and we'll think about ways that we can take advantage of these multiple intelligences in the classroom.